On this episode of the podcast, I have with me Margaret Gabriel. She is the head of talent at CoinFund. We're going to be talking about the people function within a VC. I think what's very interesting, and we're going to kind of talk about this because Margaret has a great background within the space, within the crypto space. She's going to tell us a little bit about what CoinFund does. But a lot of times, people wait to hire a people leader. And we're going to talk about some of those effects. Like, if you're going to delay that hire, maybe there's an advantage, maybe there's a disadvantage. What do you deal with when you come in that things are a little bit more further along versus not? We're going to also talk about leadership development and also what's different when you're hiring internal VC staff. Obviously, a lot of people who are listening might be familiar with, people hiring for their portfolio companies, but hiring for internal VC staff is a little bit different. Margaret, thanks for being on the show.
Oh, it's a pleasure. I'm so excited to chat about these things today. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. All right, CoinFund. Before we start, tell everyone what do you guys do over there? What kind of companies do you invest in?
Yeah, so CoinFund is an early stage Web3 crypto investment firm, and we invest across three core strategies. So early stage seed, pre-seed investing, slightly later stage Series A investing, and so that's investing in the actual projects, founders, companies. So we have over 115 crypto and Web3 companies in our portfolio. This July was actually our 9th anniversary. So I've been doing this for quite some time. And then we have our liquid strategy, which actually allows us to invest in the tokens themselves. And those, markets are very interconnected. Many of these portfolio companies have tokens that they'll launch. And so it becomes this really symbiotic investment machine. And yeah, I've been in the space doing this for 9 years. And I've been at the firm myself for a little over 2.
Awesome. I mean, we could probably do a whole episode on the dynamics of hiring within the crypto space. That's a whole different beast. We'll maybe table that for a different day. We're talking about your background. Obviously, you were at Gemini previously. You were head of learning and development. You've been in recruiting for, as you mentioned, a number of years. Head of talent at a VC firm that focuses on being a little bit more internal. Talk to us a little bit about how that role is different than maybe other head of talent at tech companies that you've had.
First of all, I think it really varies by investment firm. And I actually think it's kind of rare to see somebody in my function at an investment firm who is also focused on the internal portion of people. So what I mean by that is when I survey the heads of talent and a lot of other heads of people and a lot of other VCs, sometimes that role, especially in crypto, that role can actually end up really being a recruiter for the portfolio companies. So if you can imagine, but potentially dozens, if not like us, hundreds of portfolio companies that you've invested in. And in investing, obviously the best way that we can be successful and return capital to our LPs is if those companies are successful and have, momentous occasions like exits. And so typically investment firms try to really impact the possibility of those companies being successful. And so they'll do things like help recruit and help those founders actually bring top talent into their organizations. So that is part of my role at CoinFund. I always say that at CoinFund, I have kind of 2 roles. The first, and actually the primary role I have, is supporting the CoinFund team. So we can show our firm is a really healthy, high-performing, highly engaged place to work where our employees are excellent, that we're retaining our top people, that we're hiring the right people. And the second part of my role is acting like that outsourced, executive coach / recruiter / people consultant for all of the founders who typically haven't hired a people person yet, which we should talk about. But, I tend to think that it's really hard to actually do the second role if your firm is not, from a culture and talent perspective, at its best. And so I tend to prioritize CoinFund so that the second part is actually easier.
Interesting. Yeah, I guess we'll be bouncing back and forth between maybe these 2 responsibilities, because I think part of the podcast episode is talking about the effects really of waiting to hire a people leader, right? And I think it is funny. I've really enjoyed having VC talent folks on because they have a very different job than if you're working at internal at a company. So it's a very different discussion. And I enjoy both, but it's something I hadn't done, but I'm learning a lot. And what's really become interesting is sometimes the VC themselves don't hire the people person fast enough, because obviously that's not their core business. They're focused on doing what they do, investing and obviously you have portfolio companies going through very similar things. So maybe this is a great little segue in terms of talking about maybe both views of this. But I guess when you come into a situation, right, when the people leader role has been pushed out a little bit, right? And we're assuming people can hire people leaders earlier. But let's talk about the situation what happens when a company decides to wait. I guess at a high level, what are some of the ramifications to that?
Well, here's what's so interesting. Like this is such a fascinating topic, and I haven't figured out yet, like why companies wait. But what's so fascinating, especially when you're in VC, typically, this is especially true in Web3, but in VC, like you're talking to the most innovative people in the world. You're talking to these founders who are trying to recreate systems, produce brand new technology. And so investors who are like obviously the employees at a VC are some of the most well-educated individuals in the world when it comes to innovation, technology, trend setting, forecasting. So they're always looking forward into like what could be big, what could be impactful, what could change lives, what could, and therefore like make us really profitable and impact people in a really like sustainable, intense way. But what's so fascinating is that the concept around like leadership and people development is not like keeping up with that pace of innovation. It feels still old school, like a little archaic. And so what's fascinating about VC is that it's still in times like these partnerships are still kind of structured in that more traditional way. And compared actually to working in tech. So when I was at Google and I was at Gemini, in tech, there is so much more. It's so much more part of the culture and the vernacular that like people go through management training, that there's a people ops function, that there's feedback, that there's 360s. It's just part of like how people operations, which is a term that was coined by Google. So like they completely reinvented the concept of HR, which is typically seen as like a cost center and very compliance oriented. They rebranded this entire function and developed it. And so tech actually, I think, innovates from the people side along with the tech. But in some of these like traditional firms, I'd probably, if I had to guess, put like investment firms in here, hedge funds in here. There's still some like archaic ways of thinking about people and leadership that haven't kept up with the innovation of the actual like work and investing they're doing. And so what I think there's a lot of ramifications of that. I can talk about a few. Some of them are like, actually don't think leaders in firms get really good leadership training. You start at Google and you're going to be a manager, you are enrolled in a mandatory manager training. Like that is just part of the culture there. You don't get out. There's no way around it. It's not voluntary. Like you're in that training. When I was at Gemini, even all managers went through training with me. It was not, this was not optional. I don't actually think there's a ton of formal leadership development that gets baked into the cultures of these small firms. Some of that has to do, obviously, with just like operational costs. So firms are very small. They're not creating typically a product like a tech company where the whole point is to grow and make more revenue and keep forecasting for more revenue and budget and hiring. Firms tend to stay kind of small. You have your management fees. And so you kind of know, like, here's what we're likely going to make. If you have a hedge fund, there's more volatility, obviously. But so firms are smaller. There's like less, I think, budget for these types of hires. And all that to say, you end up with firms, I think, that just take a long time to hire on the people side, or they outsource a lot of the like HR to a PO or to, maybe a consultant, and it's not like baked into the culture of the firm. And so I think what can end up happening, the term you mentioned is important. Like I think a lot of firms can get into organizational debt and managerial debt as a result. We've heard about tech debt. There is such thing as organizational debt, which is, hey, our firm's been around for 5 years, this is hypothetical, and everyone's paid differently. And all of the titles are kind of different, even though people are coming in with the same level of experience. And now we're kind of getting some questions from our employees about that. And we don't know how to answer that. Or somebody has to get fired, but we're not really sure how to do that. And maybe we're doing that in a way that's really not great for our culture, for our brand. And like all those things create debt. Poor hiring practices, inconsistent hiring practices, all those things, organizational design, like who's reporting into who, and does that make sense? And are you keeping reporting structures that don't really make sense for a long time? All those things can like really create debt. And I think what can tend to happen is eventually executives will say, "Oh, that all that debt has now piled up, where it's eating into our times, where we're supposed to be out there investing and meeting founders, traveling, and getting in conferences, and we're getting weighed down by having to try to like get out of some of this debt and talk to employees who are unhappy and try to retain this person who's going to quit because they found out their comp doesn't make sense. And now their time is getting sucked into those people problems. And that's usually when they decide to hire. Like, we need an expert in here to come take this off of our plate so that we can like create a strategy around this so that we can go do what we're supposed to be doing, which is the investing or leaving the firm or doing strategic, decision making for the firm. And then I think that person gets hired and ends up like spending the first year just like fixing a lot of stuff and like getting us out of that debt.
So do you think, I guess, as we're talking about this managerial technical debt, organizational technical debt, I think obviously in the engineering world, technical debt's a very common concept. They understand what that means, the ramifications, why technical debt exists. I've been talking to more leaders in the talent space about this concept. I'm an ex-engineer, so I see why that term exists in the technical world. I don't see it really come up in the people and talent world. I'm starting to see us talk about this concept. You kind of articulated there is a technical debt on the people and management organizational design side. Does that get articulated that way to the business enough, or does it get articulated to the business in that fashion so that they can maybe understand it in their terms?
I don't think it does, but I think it would be hugely impactful to help shift that way and to basically say, to start using like it's very common, like human, like emotional theory that people tend to communicate best when you're like speaking a similar language. So I think it could be really helpful, especially, when you're talking about investing, especially if you're investing in technology. Most of your founders are quite technical, or they're like a founder and a CTO. So you're talking to quite technically inclined people. I think it could be really impactful to say, hey, you should think about hiring a people person because you're starting to accrue some real management debt. And we define management debt as like the sum of all the management infrastructure that should have been set up within an organization at the start, but has been continuously and sometimes deliberately deferred for later. And I think that could be, speaking about it in those terms, I think could change minds and help people think about that hire earlier. But I would also say what's interesting is that the people work still kind of like gets done, but it's oftentimes that I've seen kind of like push under the remit of like a COO or sometimes like a CFO, and they'll put like that function under an operational person. And sometimes that works if that COO, and sometimes HR functions do report into a COO at a company. That can make total sense for that company as long as that COO like understands that department and can really manage that department well and manage the leader of that department. But I don't think it works well when a COO is like a true operational wizard, doesn't really have HR or people skills, and is kind of just like told to put the people stuff like hiring and all those pieces like under their remit, at least without any like help or like advisement. It would be, if we think about the opposite, right? It would be, we would never go to a non-technical person and say like, we're just going to put like Eng under your function. And like, I'm sure you can figure that out. Like, we would never do that. But for some reason, we tend to think that the people side is something that people can kind of just like naturally pick up.
That's actually really fair. And I think those are some great examples. And I think I can see that in my mind. We have worked with a lot of startups where a chief of staff is responsible for hiring and organizational design, and it's a challenge because sometimes you see they're trying their best to navigate a path and develop an expertise in an area that's not a strength. I guess when we're kind of looking at this, and I think you hit the nail on the head that this isn't communicated this way. And I think actually this extends past, right? Actually, I've brought this up a couple of times about how on the people and talent side, I don't see, okay, I'm going to clarify because other people will message me and say, you got this wrong. I don't see a lot of project management structure. I don't see a lot of formalized ways of handling recs and open orders or different, projects that are within the people space as a formally run Scrum, Kanban, whatever methodology you want that then you can leverage. Because I think a lot of times when you are talking to the engineering team, and if we're talking about technical type startups, that's their world. They would so understand if you went to them and said, "Hey, I got this open rec that you want us to work on. We have a daily stand-up. I need you to be here these 15 minutes so you can hear what's going on. And by the way, we're going to do a retrospective at the end of the sprint, and this is what we're going to deliver in the sprint." They would probably go, "I get it. I'll put it on my calendar." I mean, probably not, but they would still put it on their calendar because it's important to them. But I think dealing with that in their world, in their concepts of extending this technical debt conversation, I'm not sure why it doesn't happen, because as talent people, we see the rituals they perform. We see that they have Scrum meetings, daily stand-ups. We all know this, but extending that and leveraging it out within the talent and people function doesn't happen a whole lot. And I guess the real question here is there formal project management that happens that I'm not seeing in talent and people? It happens. It's just maybe not formalized in these different ways we're talking about.
I think that a really good talent person will set up like excellent project management and process, whether that's how the process works from opening a requisition to closing a role and all of the stuff that entails, and then training people and going through that process with them, doing interview training, training managers to be great hiring managers. Really good people first people also do a really strong project management, cycle with timelines and dates around a performance management cycle. And they'll communicate that to the team. And then within that, they'll do a training for the managers on how to give feedback and how to receive feedback. And they'll do a training for direct reports on how to write a great assessment and how to how to do some bias training for everybody around first the common biases that come up in a performance process. So I think really, really good people, employees will set up process and project management around these things. And that's their expertise. And so they'll do that. But, what's really, I think the core question that almost feels like we're dancing around a little bit is why does it take so long for people to hire this function? And maybe the real question is why does it take so do people value this function the same way that they value other functions at a company? Why is it? And I say this with true curiosity, not an accusatory way, but why is it that when a founder thinks about building out their executive team, the first things that come to mind are CTO, COO, CFO, all of those functions, and never a chief people officer? It's almost never a first executive hire. I have seen it before, but it's really, really rare. And I tend to actually see it happen the most with founders who are second-time founders who learned a lesson and bring in a people person pretty soon. But there is, and I don't know the answer, but we're still kind of, I think, getting out of the really entrenched perspective that a people or an HR function is a cost center, is compliance related, could eventually end up being a nice to have. So having somebody who's doing people development and coaching and really good performance management process, all those things can feel like a really nice thing to have, but definitely not as critical to standing up a business as it is to get the COO and the CFO in there. And I get that. I get that to an extent. And so I would maybe advise founders who obviously have limited budget, obviously have limited headcount, especially in their beginning years. Maybe you don't hire like a full on head of people or chief people officer in your first 5 hires, but you should definitely think about a consultant and like somebody or a coach or somebody or a friend or an expert in this field who can help you, because the debt begins day one from like the executive team you build out, those first crucial hires. How are you assessing them? How are you going to retain them? How are you going to think about their comp? How are you going to recruit great people? How are you going to make sure the right people are getting along? As soon as like personalities and conflicts are starting, how are you working through those things? Like, do you have an expert to guide you through that process? And maybe it's not a full-time hire yet, but I hope we can shift to a world where founders think about a people person or a coach or consultant in the beginning.
I think it's a great observation of, I like how you put how we danced around it. I think in a way we did. I think because it's a hard question. I think you see this come up a lot about the seat at the table. And I've asked the question, and it's interesting because sometimes talent leaders there's no waiting. You have to be involved in the business. You have to, but that's when you're there. And to your point, we hear a lot about in tech companies, especially, talent is the most important component. And you see, I mean, we have a company that we're working with currently. We won't name names, but they have gone through an unreal number of candidates to hire one. I mean, the percentage is crazy, but they're looking for an exceptional person who has exceptional skills because they know how vital that is to their team. But then the people to run that process are not there, and we see the effects of it. And you kind of you got me thinking. I'm like, why would there not be that person? And there's really smart people running the company, and there's smart people managing this process. But you can also see clearly it is not their skill set. It is not being done. Like if I were to go through the process with any talent leader, they'd be like, Amir, this is not optimal. This isn't even good, but it is what it is because, so I think you bring up a great point. I think that's making me think of really the question that we've been talking about, waiting. Actually, the real question is why is the talent person not, or the people leader not hired sooner? Obviously, they can't write code. They can't ship code. So we know that's the easy out. But besides that, there's so many good things that you mentioned that somebody could bring into the table that's a great question.
I don't know the answer. If I had to guess, I think that roles that feel, I kind of hate the term soft skill and hard skill because I think I think saying something is a soft skill can give it a pejorative flavor that's not as important or not as critical. So I need to think about a new phrase for soft skill, but I think the people skill, the people work, I think can sometimes be, I think sometimes founders can trick themselves into thinking, oh, I can figure that out. I've been a manager before. And so I've given feedback. I've done a bunch of performance reviews. I've hired a bunch of people. I can do that. I don't really need a person to come. I don't really need to waste precious headcount and resources on that. And I think that way of thinking can be hard to untangle. And as founders go out and get mentors, and I think what founders are very good at they tend to be extremely well networked individuals who seek out a lot of mentorship and counseling. And I think the more we can get, and they oftentimes go to their investors for that counsel. And so I actually think the more that investment firms can start to make this change and recognize how much ahead of people helps their firm, I think the more the investor, when they speak to a founder, will have the perspective to say, hey, these things you're asking me about, this advice you're asking me about your CTO, about your budget and your runway and your headcount, a lot of that actually sounds like people related stuff. And I'm wondering if we can get you the people support, or maybe, and what's beautiful about, when investment firms have a head of people, they're there to support the founders. Maybe the founder doesn't have the budget yet to work with the people to hire their own people person, but that investor can say, why don't you talk to our head of people? And they can help you think through some of these strategies and how you can create a better relationship with the CTO and how you can, get you some stats on recruiting and budgeting for the headcount you have open. And at least if a VC has that resource within their own firm, they can help the founders have some type of people resource. But I really think it does start with VCs, learning the importance of the people function internally so they can proselytize that a little bit to their founders.
When you see early stage startups, I mean, you guys, especially in the crypto world, there's fully remote teams. So there's even more complexity that crosses geographic boundaries that we can't even get into today because we're just trying to talk about the high level. But you do see founders that are so focused on the next milestone, the next goal, that even though, and especially like you said, second time, third time founders might see some of the benefit to bring that person in early. First time founder might be running so hard. And that's what I found really interesting when I'm speaking to people who are at VC on the talent side, is that advising piece has become critical because it's a sounding board. It's someone they can talk to. And if I'm a founder and I'm put myself in that shoes and my responsibility is to execute, do I really want to go to people and say, I really don't know how to do this? How is that going to be looked upon? And I think sometimes we have created a stigma that, and I'm not going to go into imposter syndrome because this is not it, but it's a case of going, I don't want to let somebody know I don't know how to hire because they're going to ask me, well, how the hell are you going to build out this team? So we put the founders in a little bit of a tight corner, not to say that this is the reason they don't bring in talent people early, but I do like the fact that you mentioned the VC people, especially on the talent side, can be that advisor. And I think that's fantastic.
I read once, I think about this all the time, where some of the 3 hardest phrases for executives to say are, I need help, I was wrong, I don't know. And I think that's especially true for founders who have probably just come off of maybe years of their whole job is to build conviction and convey confidence and to show that they're incredibly capable and that they deserve the huge check that this investment firm just wrote for them, and that they're visionary and that they're just unbelievably competent. And you're right, where we then set them up and then we can penalize them later for being, well, why didn't you ask for help? Or why didn't you admit you didn't know something? And I think that's really, it is a really hard place for them to be. And again, I know I'm so biased here because I'm advocating for my function, but I do still think that the head of people can be this beautifully approachable person that sits between the functions and is hey, I have so much skin in the game. In general, all I want is for that founder to be successful, because it also serves my firm for you to be successful. So my only intention is to help you. And I can be this in-between person, this buffer, to talk about some of the things that are harder to work through than doing so in front of the very experienced, professional, incredibly brilliant VC who just wrote you a check. I do think the people person can be an amazing resource for founders also, and just help bring some of that temperature down and to allow them to be a little bit more vulnerable and honest about the areas where they're struggling. And this is also biased because I think we all tend to see the problems of a business through the lens of the department in which we are in. So I think if we were talking to a CMO, they might see all the issues of a company through the problems with the brand, or or their identity or visual identity. But the thing I always think to is I always think that at the end of the day, the biggest problems a founder ends up navigating or a company ends up navigating are people problem. I think companies get brought down by interpersonal conflict. I think, 2 executives not getting along can literally bury a company. I think hiring the wrong people is catastrophic. I think paying people incorrectly is catastrophic. All those people problems end up I think, being more critical than anything else. And so if you phrase it like that, as like saving you money or like, providing you money, I also think that can be a way for people to be convinced of like, I should hire somebody to help me avoid those pitfalls.
All right. Well, I think we've opened up a can of good worms, because I think this is a lot of good conversation and dialogue that I know we're not going to get to. Some of the finality that I like. So this is more of I think it's a great conversation. Obviously, within the crypto space, you've had extensive amount of time, obviously working with startups. If somebody wants to reach out to you, whether it's something you mentioned on the podcast about CoinFund or just general expertise, they want to tap you on the shoulder to learn a little bit more about, what's a good way of connecting with you?
I am on Telegram, which is obviously very, very popular in Web3. Happy to share my hand there. Always happy to hear. Like I'm old school and analog. Like I love an email. Happy to get an email. I am on Twitter. I don't tweet that much, but I think Telegram and email are the best way to. I'd love to hear from people if you're interested in people concepts, or you're a founder and you need guidance on people things. I'd love to hear from you and support. So I'm always happy to talk, and happy to share the email and the Telegram handle with you.
Awesome. All right, we'll put some of those in to the show notes. Obviously, make sure if somebody does want to reach out to you and talk to you, to be able to do that. That's it for the episode. Again, thank you for being on the show. It's been a great conversation. We'll be back again, different guest, different topic. Until then, two things. One, I think it's a great conversation we had. I think, I don't know, typically my episodes have details of how to do something or how somebody dealt with something. I think this was more of a conversation around a question that's probably, I think Margaret did a good job of articulating was what we were dancing around. And I think once we talked about it, there's a lot of things that are obvious that don't get discussed. And I think she made some great points, and share this with somebody else, whether it's somebody else in TA or maybe a founder who could benefit from hearing this episode. I appreciate that. Like, subscribe, comment. Let me know how the podcast is going for you guys. Until next time, thank you and goodbye.